and maybe whether or not you're in a job search and you just heard about this, excited to have you here and present to you today on this topic. So we're going to talk a little bit about imposter syndrome today. And it is such a relevant topic for so many of us. And I want to start off by telling you about an experience that I had early on in my business. So I started my career coaching business about 8 years ago. And one of the things that I wanted to do to help promote my business was to do speaking. And so I went to this speaker training. It was a multi-day speaker training. It was out of town. There were a lot of arrangements that needed to be made for me to attend this training. And throughout the 3 days, we had many, many opportunities just to get up on stage, get up on stage, get up on stage over and over and over again. And on the last day of the training, we had one more opportunity to get up on stage, but this time it was different than all the other times. This time, it was volunteer only. There was not going to be time for everyone in the group to get up on stage again. So they said, whoever wants to get up on stage one more time, go ahead and stand up and come around and line up at the side of the stage, and we'll take the volunteers. So the first thought that popped into my head when they made this announcement was, I want to get up on stage one more time. And the thought that followed almost immediately after was, who do you think you are? That's right. I have this little voice of self-doubt in my head. Maybe you can relate. I call my voice the itty bitty shitty committee. And, kind of putting a fun spin on it helps me put it in perspective. But that particular day at that training, that itty bitty shitty committee said to me, who do you think you are? What are people here going to think of you if you get up out of your seat and you go over to volunteer to get up on stage one more time? Boy, people here might think that you're really full of yourself. They might wonder, who is this person getting up to talk again? Haven't we heard from her enough already? All of these thoughts were just going through my head, and I stayed in my seat. I did not get up. And the facilitators of the event said, okay, everyone who's standing up right now, the volunteers who are standing up, that's all we're going to have time for. We won't be taking any more volunteers. So one by one, the volunteers were getting up on stage, and they had to walk right by me because I just happened to be sitting at the end of the front row, right next to the stairs that led onto the stage. So I sat there as person after person who had been braver than me had gotten up to volunteer. They walked right by me to get up for their chance to get on stage one more time. So now this itty bitty shitty committee, I hadn't lost it. It was still there. Now it was berating me for staying in my seat. It was saying things to me like, you spent money to be here. You took time off from your business to be here. Why wouldn't you take every opportunity that you could to learn from this experience? So I had this pit in my stomach. I was just sitting there feeling pretty crappy about the fact that I had given up this chance to get up on stage one more time. And I started to think, maybe if we finish early, they'll take a few more volunteers, maybe. So I'm looking at the clock and looking at the line and calculating in my mind about how much time each person was talking and how much time we had left before the event was supposed to end. And did I think that we were going to wrap up early and that they might take some more volunteers? But it became pretty clear that there wasn't going to be time. In fact, we were maybe even going to go over time already. And that I had just missed my chance. My chance was gone. And the second to last speaker, she paused. She walked by me and she paused before she took that first step onto the stage. And she changed direction. She walked over to me at the end of the front row and she leaned over and she said, Chrysta, I want you to take my place. Now, I'm not sure exactly what my face is doing. I'm not very good at hiding my facial expressions. My guess is that it was something like this. because she repeated herself and she said, Chrysta, I want you to take my place. I think you have something important to say, and I want to hear from you again. So I got up on stage and I told some version of this story. And I'm not going to lie to you, like tears. I had a few tears coming out, you know, it was a pretty overwhelming experience. And I vowed that day on stage that I was not going to stay in my seat any longer. And that if there was an opportunity that I truly desired to take on, that I was going to get up and do it, regardless of what that itty bitty shitty committee had to say about it. And because I had told this story, the facilitators of the event were kind enough to go ahead and let the person who had given up her spot for me, she still got to go at the end. So that worked out really well. But that moment, right, that day, I decided I am not going to stay in my seat any longer because I have something important to say and somebody out there wanted to hear from me. And whether or not you are a professional speaker, probably not. A lot of people don't like getting up and talking in front of groups, but I know the same is true for you. I know that you have something really valuable to offer and that there is someone out there who is looking for exactly what you have to offer. They're looking for your skill set. They're looking for your experience. They're looking for your brilliance because you have something important to give and someone is looking for you. So a few months after this opportunity, I got an opportunity to present at Fort Collins Startup Week. I was actually asked if I would give a presentation on imposter syndrome. And I'm not staying in my seat anymore, right? I'm taking advantage. I had vowed on stage that day that I was going to take advantage of every opportunity that came my way. And so when I was asked to present on imposter syndrome, I said yes. And I started researching because I had not presented on this topic before, and I wasn't sure exactly what it was, what was involved, what it was all about. And what I found in my research fascinated me because I realized that I have experienced imposter syndrome many times over in my life. And in fact, what I had experienced that day at that speaker training was imposter syndrome. I didn't get up and line up at the side of the stage because I felt like I was somehow a fraud, like I didn't quite belong there, like I hadn't earned my place to get up on stage one more time. And I also realized in my research that many of my coaching clients also experienced imposter syndrome at some point in time. So I want to talk about what is imposter syndrome. I love this definition that's here on the slide: the persistent inability to believe that your success is deserved or has been legitimately achieved as the result of your own efforts or skills. Okay. So another definition of imposter syndrome that's widely used is the persistent fear of being found out as a fraud. Now, that was the first definition that I had encountered of imposter syndrome, and I didn't think that I had experienced it when I first heard that definition, because my itty bitty shitty committee, it doesn't use the word fraud. It uses different words to tell me that my success is not deserved and hasn't been legitimately achieved. So I like this definition better, and I'm going to put this out there for you because I think this is great. Think about all of those moments that you have felt like, I don't deserve this success. I haven't legitimately achieved this. And I've seen it over and over and over again. In fact, that very first time I spoke on imposter syndrome at Fort Collins Startup Week, there was a young woman, a CSU student in the audience. And after my presentation, she asked me if we could meet for coffee later in the week. And when we met for coffee, she was telling me that she had just received an internship with NASA, but she did not feel like she deserved it. And so she's telling me, like, I don't know how this happened. I don't know why NASA would have picked me for this internship. I feel like they must have made a mistake. And so, you know, this young woman, she had just accomplished this huge thing. She had received this internship with NASA, and she was doubting herself. She was feeling like she hadn't deserved it, like it hadn't been legitimately achieved. So this is just so relevant, and it happens to so many of us. So I'd like to just pause here for a quick moment and check in with you. Is there anyone here today who can resonate with this feeling? Like, what is this conversation bringing up for you? You can either put something in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself and share, I'd love to hear from you.
Can I talk about experience that actually resonated with me about imposter syndrome?
Mm-hmm.
When I was in middle school, I tried really hard to get into a good high school, and then I could try really hard to get into a good college. And then after starting my job, I'm also trying hard to work hard to become a best employee. And through the process of climbing up the ladder, I always feel that people around me are better than me, although although sometimes I being selected for reward, or and I feel like, oh, they're just as good or even better than I am, and I don't really deserve that. And I think that really resonated with me.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for sharing. Absolutely. Anyone else have something you want to share? Yeah, Elle, I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, hi. That really resonated with me also for similar reasons. I think especially as a woman of color, when I enter a space, there's always like a need to prove myself, like to prove that I deserve to be there in the room in a way that I feel like other people don't have to. And I see myself and other women in the space just really like struggling to constantly be the last ones in the office, the first ones at the beginning of the day, the ones that are like pushing to get projects recognized and having to speak in a louder voice than everyone else so that our opinions are taken seriously. So it's yeah, it really resonates. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, Ellen. I think that's so, I mean, we know there's a lot of research out there that, like, systemically for women and for you know, people of color, there is more pressure to perform at higher levels than other individuals. But the feeling of imposter syndrome specifically, I mean, it often will be that internal feeling of like, it's never enough. Like, I have to keep doing more and more and more and giving more and more and more of myself, and I have to keep achieving, because it's a feeling of like, I'm not enough, my contribution isn't enough, my qualifications aren't enough, I have to keep proving myself, and even still it doesn't feel like enough. Peace, I'd love to hear from you.
Hi, that really resonated. I would say my imposter syndrome, it's not even about, I think it's more, do I deserve to be here? Not, do I deserve my success? And that relates to, I work in higher education, so colleges and university environment. I don't have a PhD, and there's a real premium on PhDs there. So there's a reality, but I bring a lot from the outside world. And I've really been trying to embrace and share that. I'm a single mom, and what Elle just said resonates. Most people at my job didn't know I was a single mom probably till several years in, because I would say I can travel. I can. I don't have these constraints. And no one knew. And then another thing I would say no one knew is I'm a success out of foster care. And I think I have a lot to add there, you know, personal experience that could really inform a lot. But most people, I admit that I'm holding back on that. It's personal, but it also, I feel, I'm not quite the same as other people.
Mhm.
And yeah, imposter syndrome on a number of levels, but I'm also aware that I'm the one who stands in the way, because then when people learn these things about me, they start tapping some of those experiences.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. And we've got 2 more raised hands, so I'm going to take those 2 and then we'll move on. So Rick?
Yeah, I thought it was very interesting how your itty bitty shitty committee first told you that you had nothing to say, and then when you didn't volunteer, berated you for not taking the opportunity. I think that's just classic. Really, really helpful of it. But also as a freelancer, I have very, very often taken on opportunities that were beyond what they were, advertising the position for. And I just sort of was like, well, yeah, I know I can do that. I'll
Mhm.
handle that. And I took it. And that was never really an issue because I was able to pull it off. And even though I would have, people who were maybe better educated in school and so on, sort of give me trouble for, not knowing all the terms of this or that, never really hit me very hard. But I did have one in in this last employee position that I took. Um, I worked there for 5 months, and their onboarding process was very difficult. And after 5 months, they just fired me, and it was like, really? um, it wasn't my itty bitty shitty committee. It was the real. It had manifested in the real world, but I still just kind of I don't know. I don't really believe that it was a good idea for them to have fired me. I think I should have done fine. So I don't know. I have a little bit different take on that, but I definitely experience it all the way through. Like when I'm taking on a position that, they don't maybe think I could do. I wonder, will I be able to pull it off? And normally I do.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Thank you for so much for sharing. I mean, there's definitely many people, especially that have marginalized identities or intersectional marginalized identities, do experience systemic factors that contribute to imposter syndrome, but also real experiences or direct, I'm going to say it's all real, but like direct experiences also, like, being hired and then getting, fired after 5 months. Those kinds of experiences also contribute to that, can contribute to that feeling of imposter syndrome. If you're like, hey, I showed up, I tried my best. I did what they had asked me to do, and like still somehow I wasn't good enough. So like both can come into play. And so much, the history behind our own histories, like Peace, you talked about, being a success story as a foster. And like, for me, I grew up in poverty in the Denver area, with a lot of mental illness in my family that I had to contend with. And I'm also neurodivergent. I have often felt like I don't belong in a lot of environments. And so that's been a factor for me, but there's so many different ways that we can come to this very similar feeling that a lot of us have, despite the reasons, what influenced it in the first place. It's a really pretty relatable. Like someone put in the comment, Roger put, even Stephen Colbert once admitted he was not worthy of his success, that he was fooling everyone into thinking he was good at what he did. So, we know that like even these like really successful people, Stephen Colbert, Tom Hanks has talked about experiencing imposter syndrome. Maya Angelou has talked about it. I mean, it's people with
Paul
such
McCartney. Paul
yeah,
McCartney.
Paul McCartney, like people with really varied
Going up on
backgrounds.
stage thinking, no, nobody's going to like his song,
Yeah, like who am I? Like I kind of suck. Like what is this? Yeah, it's a really relatable experience despite having really different backgrounds. Josiah, I'd like to hear from you and then we'll move on. We're not hearing you, Josiah. It does not look like you're muted. So, oh, there we go.
Yeah, this ties in really well with what Rick was saying and what Peace was saying. So I was a freelancer and I was doing all of this kind of research-oriented work, and I just had the same kind of repeated comment that, you know, Josiah, if you're going to be doing all of this very sciencey stuff, you need to have a PhD because you're basically really underqualified to be doing all this very high level stuff. So, you know, there was kind of a lot of, you know, basically people accusing me of being an imposter, right? So I go and I get this PhD, you know, on other people's recommendation, essentially. And I thought that would kind of fix the problem. What I didn't realize was it's actually really psychologically difficult experience to go through, like basically 4 years of working really hard on a project and just getting criticized the entire time. And, you know, once I was done with it, like, you know, I was awarded a PhD and everything, but I think it just made the whole imposter syndrome worse because then I'm like, I can just see all of the things that I'm doing wrong. And, you know, I didn't feel any more confident. I actually felt less confident at the end of the whole thing. So now I'm sort of walking around like, man, there's all these things that I'm doing wrong, right? So I gotta say, I'm not sure there's like really a cure for it, at least in terms of just stacking up credentials or anything. And that may be why we see even very successful people still have that. And maybe it's, you know, not necessarily like I can definitely tell you education isn't the solution.
Right. I really appreciate you shared that, Josiah. The last time I gave this presentation at an organization that hired me to come in and talk, you know, there was a lot of people in the room who had degrees that matched up to the jobs that they had, and they were still experiencing it. And we were talking about this idea that like imposter syndrome is a liar. Like it tells you, it's the feeling that I somehow haven't achieved this success or don't deserve it. But that's not true. You can have all this evidence that shows that you have legitimately achieved the success. You can have the PhD, you can have the degrees and still not feel it because it's like an internal experience, right? Imposter syndrome is an internal experience. It's not a mental illness. It's not some kind of disease or anything like that. It's, you know, it's really just this feeling that we have inside of us. So I want to talk a little bit about who is affected by imposter syndrome and what is the impact of talking about it. So it's really universal. When imposter syndrome was first researched, it was believed that it was something that happened predominantly to high achieving women. But we have since found, and there's been a lot of research that shows it's really universal. It's all genders experience it. People from all different demographic backgrounds experience it. Educational backgrounds experience it. Different levels of success. I mean, it's a really universal experience that so many people have had. And the impact of talking about it. So there's been some interesting conversation that's happened over the last several years. I've been speaking on imposter syndrome for about 6 or 7 years now. And I have given, you know, this presentation hundreds of times. I've had conversations with people before and after giving this presentation. And so what's been happening more recently in recent years is that there's been a movement towards the systemic causes behind imposter syndrome. And there was actually an article that said, and it was an article that Brene Brown, I believe, had like retweeted and started sharing that said, stop telling women they have imposter syndrome. And we need to stop talking about imposter syndrome. And this article was basically saying that because there can be systemic causes to imposter syndrome, we need to be addressing the systemic factors that are causing people to feel this rather than telling individuals that they may be experiencing imposter syndrome, because that's putting the onus and the responsibility for addressing this on the individual. And I wanted to bring this up because some of you may have come across this article or conversations around this, or you may find them, you know, you may come across it in the future. And I personally feel like I absolutely want us as a society to address systemic causes for imposter syndrome. I think that's really important work that absolutely should be done. I also believe that we need to empower individuals by giving them language to use around the experiences they're having, right? So, if you are experiencing imposter syndrome, it can be empowering and helpful to have language around it and to have conversations around it, because creating change to systemic problems is going to take generations. We're not going to solve systemic problems in 5 years or 10 years or maybe even 20 years. And so while we're working on that, we still need to be giving people the terminology, the language, and the opportunity to talk openly about what they are experiencing so that we have ways to work through this rather than getting stuck by it, so that we are not staying in our seat. So we're not missing out on opportunities that we want to take advantage of for fear that we somehow don't deserve it or have not legitimately achieved it. And that's just my belief. And please feel free to disagree with me on anything I say in this presentation or any presentation that I give, because I do want to honor that I'm going to speak about what we generally find to be true, or what the research shows, or what I have experienced myself. And that is going to be true for most people. However, I also always create space for your lived experience. Your lived experience is correct for you. So if you have experienced something that I'm talking about in a way that is different than I'm talking about it, you are 100% right. Your experience is valid and it is real, and that is how it is for you. And if you have experienced it differently and you want to share that with me, I would love to hear from you. I did put my information in on the sign-in sheet. So like any of you, please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn or email me directly. But I just want you to know, like, it's totally okay to disagree with me. And if your experience is different, your experience is valid and it is correct. Okay, so just kind of wanted to put that out there. So what causes imposter syndrome? Well, it's generally believed, at least at this point in time with the research that we have available right now, that the cause of imposter syndrome, in addition to systemic causes, is the inability to integrate our accomplishments and achievements. Okay, so we're getting degrees, we're getting positive feedback on the work that we're doing, we're getting compliments, but for some reason internally, it's just difficult to take ownership of that. It's difficult to claim that. And one way that I see this show up is a game that I really love to play. I absolutely love to play this game that I call Compliment Dodgeball. Anyone else here like to play Compliment Dodgeball? You may be familiar with this. When someone gives you praise or positive feedback, or they give you a compliment, and the very last thing you are willing to do is to let it hit you, right? It's like, I'm going to jump out of the way. I'm going to minimize or dismiss that positive feedback. I'm going to tell you why it wasn't true. Maybe I'm going to tell you how it really wasn't that great, or didn't you notice when I made that one little mistake? I had actually been planning to do something different, but I said this instead, right? Compliment Dodgeball. It's really not a fun game. Yet I'm really good at playing it, and I find it so common. So many of us are just not great at truly receiving and taking in positive feedback. And I believe this is one of the factors that contributes to the experience of imposter syndrome. Because remember, it's that inability to believe your success is deserved or that it was legitimately achieved. Well, if you are dismissing or deflecting or minimizing positive feedback, you're like, I am not allowing myself to believe that these things are true about me. So someone is giving you positive feedback and it's just like, nope, I'm not going to hear that. I'm not going to take it in. I'm not going to own that at any level. So one thing you can do to engage with imposter syndrome differently is to practice receiving and believing compliments. Can you believe when someone gives you positive feedback? Can you practice believing that? Can you practice really allowing yourself to integrate that positive feedback, even if you can only hold on to it for like 5 or 10 seconds at first. This can be hard to do. If this is a challenge for you, if you're a pro at compliment dodgeball, like this one right here, this is probably going to be the hardest, the most challenging tip that I have for you. But I really invite you to practice it, to start noticing, and to tell people in your lives, tell family and friends, or if you have an accountability partner or a mentor or a coach, tell them is that you are practicing receiving positive feedback differently. Because when people know that you're doing this and they see you start to dismiss it, sometimes they can gently call you out and say, you know, hey, I just gave you a compliment. Can you pause for a moment and take that in? Right? And so that can be the fun part. I mean, you can certainly work on this on your own, but it can be way more effective if you have other people helping you. When I give this presentation in person, I often do a breakout exercise where I have people compliment each other for 2 minutes and to respond to each compliment by saying, thank you, I know, which sounds super awkward and it feels really ridiculous when you're doing it. But that's the point, right? Is we're kind of trying to push you out of your comfort zone. You're obviously not going to walk around out on the street, you know, or in your job on a day-to-day basis saying, thank you, I know. When someone tells you you did a good job, that would just, you know, might not come off the way that we intend. But for the sake of just like a little practice exercise, it's a way to stretch into that feeling of like, can I actually believe that something positive someone says about me is true? And the funny thing is, if you like playing compliment dodgeball as much as I do, you may find this to be true for you too. It can be difficult for me to take in positive feedback, but negative feedback, oh, that I'm sure that belongs to me. I am sure that that is mine. I am sure that that is absolutely true, that that does in fact apply to me. Right? If somebody gives me some negative feedback or they complain about me, it is so easy for me to take that in. So easy. But positive feedback, it's like, I'm not sure about that. Like, I don't know that I think they were confused or they just didn't realize that I actually screwed up. But negative feedback, like I'm going to take that and I'm going to like, you know, cuddle it and rub it on my cheek. And maybe I'll like slip it under my pillow when I sleep so that it like, I'm keeping it really close. Right. So just like, I want you to notice what your patterns are around feedback. Do you find it much, much easier to accept negative feedback than positive? Because if you do, if you're like me and you find the negative feedback to be easy to take in, but the positive feedback to be challenging, then there's an imbalance there. And hopefully we would actually have balance where we can take in both and be discerning, right? So, you know, where are you on this? Yeah, Amy, I'd love to hear from you.
I heard something somewhere along these lines of, if you can believe the negative comments about you, challenge yourself, why can't you believe the positive comments? Because they really should be in balance.
Yeah. Christine, what about you?
I just want to add, and I know it's hard for everybody to accept compliments, but I think the thing that helps me the most is before I get negative about something positive, just say thank you and then think about it. And I mean, that's really all you have to do is say thank you. You may not agree with it, but it gives you time to think about it a little bit more and internalize it.
Yeah.
But it's hard. I agree with you.
Yeah. And you know, what I like to suggest, and again, tweak this as it works for you, but what I like to suggest if you're going to work on receiving compliments differently, is to, yes, say thank you, but to also like create a practice for yourself where you take a breath when someone tells you something positive, you take a breath, really feel your feet on the ground before you respond at all. So like before you even say thank you, that you just like, thank you. You know, and so, you know, again, tweak this as it works for you, but that breath and that feeling your feet on the ground is like grounding you in that moment. And the response, the thank you response, can come after, like, you've let that compliment sit with you for a moment. When you say thank you, you're giving something back to that other person. And so even by pausing for just a few seconds to take a breath and to let that compliment just like hang there in the air, and maybe as you're taking the breath, maybe you're even breathing it in and you're like feeling like, what does that feel like what does that feel like in my body to hear that I did something good, or that someone admires something about me, that I did a good job on this project. Like, what does that feel like in my body, just to like allow that to be here for a moment. So we'll take Rick and Trent and then we'll move on. So Rick, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, when I look at it, if you can imagine somebody that never has any imposter syndrome, that is just the most arrogant person you can imagine. And, to that extent, I see it as a healthy thing. And it's just that, you don't want to, like a person who doesn't have any at all is probably just completely encompassed by it. He's actually terrified that he might possibly be an imposter, rather than just accepting the fact, that, okay, so we're all faking it a little bit. But so anyway, that's all. I just I think it's something that you need to be able to take a look at it, and then just move on, just
Yeah.
do the best with what you can.
Yeah. Just notice where you are on the spectrum, and what is the skill that you need to work on? Is it receiving compliments, or is it being able to be more open to receiving criticism? Most of us, especially people who show up for a talk that has imposter syndrome in the title, most of those people are needing to work on receiving compliments more, right? Like that's an area that they're weak in. But we're all different for sure. Yeah, Trent?
Yeah, it just seems like the foundation of this is just one sense of self-esteem, right? That to the extent that you're not able to receive compliments, one could interpret that as an indicator of just how inaccurate, right? If you could objectify, what did I actually do, and if someone else did that thing, how would I interpret that? And wow, that's really fantastic. But since I did it, it seems unimportant, right? Well, okay, then clearly I'm interpreting that inaccurately, right? So clearly my sense of self-esteem is poorly calibrated, right? And then one can use that as a way to maybe reinterpret their own sense of self-esteem, and maybe I need to do some work there. So
yeah, absolutely. I agree. And a lot of the coaching clients that I work with, I do occasionally work with job seekers, but I work with people who are employed as well. And also entrepreneurs and business owners, because, my particular specialty in coaching and what I work on with my clients is really on their sense of worth and how that presents and shows up at work. And if your sense of worth is not good, then you're communicating that to people you work with all the time. You're whether you realize it or not, you're telling people you work with, like, I'm not really that hot stuff, right? Like, I don't think I'm that great. My work isn't that great. And we communicate that in both direct and indirect ways. And so, when I'm working with people, whether or not they're in a job search, it's really usually about addressing some of those issues of worth behind the scenes. Because I often work with people, for example, that are like kind of that classic overgivers. Like, they're always doing more and more and more, giving more and more and more, volunteering for everything. If they're asked to do something, they almost always say yes. But, for people who are in that position, that often leads to like really crap work-life balance. It leads to this feeling like I'm never enough. I'm never good enough. What I do isn't enough. And honestly, it also tends to lead to people being way underpaid where they should be getting paid. And so that's kind of my specialty. And I absolutely agree. It does tie into that sense of self-value, self-worth, that self-esteem. They're all interrelated. Absolutely. Yeah. So I want to give you two more tips, and we're, running short on time. So I'm going to go ahead and breeze through. My second tip for you, if you want to engage differently with imposter syndrome, is not necessarily to brag. I use the word brag here, again, to kind of stretch you out of your comfort zone, but to practice talking about what you're good at. If the only time you talk about your skills is in a job interview or a performance review, or if you happen to work for yourself, if it's in a sales conversation, if the only time you ever talk about your strengths and what you're good at is in those situations, it's not going to be natural to talk about. It's going to feel awkward. It might feel very difficult. So I would absolutely love for you to practice talking more about what you're good at and what your skills and your strengths are. Because first of all, our words have power. When we say things out loud, even if no one else is in the room. In my book, and all these illustrations for my presentation are actually illustrations from my book. So I love using them here. But in my book, I talk about, for example, looking in the mirror and making positive statements to yourself. And so, even if it's just to yourself, it'll feel silly to do. I mean, don't get me wrong. It's going to feel really ridiculous. You're going to feel ridiculous looking at yourself in the mirror and saying something positive about yourself. But the more you do it, the easier it becomes. It feels less silly, and you will start to believe it. If you're saying negative things about yourself out loud, even just to yourself, you start to believe that. If you say positive things about yourself out loud, then you'll start to believe that too. But also look for opportunities to say it to other people, not in a way that is arrogant, but just in a way that is honest and authentic, right? And so people often, when I give this presentation, people often say, well, but I don't want to come across as arrogant. And I'm like, I hear you. I absolutely hear you. And again, most people who show up for a presentation about imposter syndrome are really far away from being arrogant most of the time, right? Like you have a lot of room to get way more comfortable talking yourself up before anyone would actually consider you to be arrogant. Because there is a benefit, there is a healthy, or there can be a healthy integration to arrogance. I don't have to be on the extreme, on either end of the extreme. I think the healthy integration, like in that mid-range, is where I am not only the most fulfilled personally and professionally, but where I have the most ability and capacity to share my skills and my gifts with the world. So, practice, whether it's just to yourself or also even out loud, like talking about, yeah, I'm pretty good at that. I think I can help you with that project. Is just an example of what that might look like to say that out loud.
Yeah, it's just called confidence, right?
Exactly. And then the last tip that I have to share with you is to start keeping track of your accomplishments. And this is something that I tell almost all of my coaching clients that I work with them, is to keep a running list of what you have accomplished. It's great if you write it down. I have an accountability partner in my business, and every week I check in with her and I tell her what I accomplished the week before. And it's that regular practice of acknowledging all the progress that I'm making, all the big and small wins, that helps me engage differently with imposter syndrome. Because if I'm acknowledging, first of all, to myself, but also to another human being, all of my progress, then that helps me feel like my success is legitimately achieved, because every week I'm acknowledging, this is the progress I made. These are my big and small wins. And it's that practice of noticing and speaking it out loud that's really important. And this is such a great thing to do, particularly if you're traditionally employed, is to keep a list of your accomplishments for several reasons. Not only will it help improve your confidence in yourself, and it will help you engage differently with imposter syndrome if you do this regularly, but also when you have a performance review coming up, it's hard to remember or give yourself credit for accomplishments that happened 6 months ago or 9 months ago. But if you're on an annual performance review cycle, if you have this list, it's easy to go back through and look at like what you've truly accomplished in your role over the last year. And there's ways to leverage this in a performance review conversation with your manager. We don't have time to get into that today, but like I work with my clients on that. Like, how do you leverage this list of accomplishments once you have it so that you have a better performance review, right? And it also is really helpful if you are unexpectedly laid off or unemployed, because now you have a list of things that you accomplished at that job, which can help offset sometimes some of that. You know, it can feel like a confidence hit to lose your job, to be laid off or to be fired. It can affect your confidence, but if you can go back and look at, like, I have this list of things I accomplished on this job, that can be helpful. But it can also be things that you use in interviews when they're like, tell us about a time when, you know, that question. If you've got this ongoing list of accomplishments, you've got a whole bunch of interview answers right there, already thought out. So keeping a list of your accomplishments ongoing just is so beneficial for you in so many ways. And it's just only going to help you succeed and engage differently with imposter syndrome should it come up for you. If you're like me and you experience it regularly, yeah, like you might experience it again and again. When I was a new speaker, I experienced it. When I started writing my book, when I published my book, I experienced it, right? Like it keeps coming up for me. But the more I work on these things, the more I recognize it right away when it happens, and the less frequently I allow it to keep me in my seat. I don't stay in my seat anymore because I know what it is, and I practice these tips that I'm sharing with you so that I can engage with it differently. Okay, so I just want to remind you that you have something of worth and value to contribute, personally and professionally. And there is not just one person, there are multiple people who want and need your unique and valuable contributions. I invite you not to stay in your seat, to practice these tools and tips to engage differently with how you integrate your accomplishments so that you can move through the world more confidently, so that you can get paid more, so that you can just take advantage of more opportunities. So just to wrap us up, I'm going to say I absolutely would love to hear from you. Please connect with me. I did put my contact information on the sign-in sheet. You can email me directly. You can connect with me on LinkedIn. A lot of the stuff that I talked about today is in my book, Beautiful Badass, How to Believe in Yourself Against the Odds. It's available on Amazon, barnesandnoble.com. It's at Boulder Bookstore. It's at Old Firehouse Books in Fort Collins. It's also at the Midnight Oil in Greeley. Thank you so much for having me today. And I will turn it back over to the organizers.
Great. We have a couple of minutes for Q&A. Final questions for Chrysta.
Well, let me say, Chrysta, thank you so much for presenting to us. That was fantastic. Lots of, it's just a very valuable, I think, important information. And Trent, do you want to stop recording now?
Sure.
And see, Mark.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, Chrysta, you've really changed my life. Your ability to talk about mental health issues and things like the imposter syndrome, and just meeting you has been a joy to my life. And I'm glad we've become friends. And you're an incredible person.